So the question is, has any classroom anywhere in the world ever taught a language successfully? The likely answer is, obviously, in this audience here, probably the average number of languages that we speak is 3 or more. Yes? And so obviously we ask the question as to how did I learn these languages? Was it in the classroom or was it in some other form? A few years ago, we did a little study. We took 9th standard students from 5 of Chennai's top schools. These 9th standard students had studied Hindi from class 1 to class 9, had scored more than 70% marks in Hindi, but did not have any Hindi in their environment, which means that their Hindi came only from the classroom. There was no external influence. To put it very simply, to ask them, "Aapka naam kya hai? What is your name?" They can answer the question. You ask them, "Aap kahan rehte hain? Where do you live?" They can answer the question. You ask them, "Aapke pitaji ka naam kya hai? What is your father's name?" They will answer the question. Then you ask them, "Aapke pitaji kya karte hain?" Suddenly, the eyes go wide and there is no answer. Because somehow in all the compositions that they had done from class 1 to class 9, that particular question was never answered. So they don't know to answer that question. It's amusing, but worse than that is the fact that each of these children from class 1 to class 9 had put in a lot of effort, 1,500 hours of classroom, homework, tuitions, etc., etc. So it's not trivial. The teachers who taught them also worked pretty hard through this whole process. So once again, it is not trivial. So when you look at the amount of effort that went in, and when you look at what did I get in return for this, is simply that I can pass my exams, but I cannot, understand or speak Hindi fluently, and probably the worst of all, I don't enjoy Hindi as a language. Here you are being exposed to some of the most beautiful literary works of Premchand, Mahashweta Devi, etc. And the student curses them all the time because I have to do questions and answers on all these people who I don't understand what they are talking, why they are torturing me. So this is a big tragedy. Is this an isolated situation? I speak 5 languages. My mother tongue is Tamil. I am born and brought up in Mumbai, so I learn Hindi and Marathi. My native place is in Kerala, so I learn Malayalam. My parents speak English, so I speak English. All of this was achieved by the time that I was 5 or 6. For 5 years, I learned French in a very, very good school, very good French teachers. I topped my class in French. I can't speak 5 sentences of French. When you look at the government schools where they're teaching English from class 1 to 10, once again they pass their exams, but they neither understand nor can they speak English. Is this a unique situation to India? Not at all. You go to the US, for 5 to 7 years, students learn Spanish in the classroom. Again, very good teachers, very good facilities, a lot of sincere effort, but at the end of that process, they do not speak Spanish. Unless they have a Spanish friend, or they have a Spanish maid, or something like that. So this is something that we find uniformly throughout the world. Wherever you go, in a situation where your language learning has come only from the classroom, language learning has never been achieved. And this is a fundamental reality that we need to accept. Yet all of us know that it's easy to learn a language, right? After all, we learned our mother tongues. There was no major effort involved there. So how did we do that? It's necessary to examine this. When you are learning your mother tongue, parents and elders and others around you speak to you. You don't understand anything that they're speaking. But then using their voice expression, using their facial expression, using their actions, and using objects or pictures, there is some communication happening. This communication at some point in time results in a language outcome. Easy, right? Yes or no? So let's try an experiment. I'm going to speak to you in a language that you most likely do not know. I'm going to use all those devices, which is voice expression, facial expression, actions, and objects. And I'd like you to see whether it relates to you. I'm holding a big red ball in my hand. What am I holding? A big red ball. And I'm going to play with you as if you are my children. As I'm playing with you, I'm going to talk. Ze kador adom ve gadol. Zeho adom ve bohek. Ani ohev lesachek ba kador. Zrokote lai. Ani yeko lehasik oto kiho gadol. Ani ohev seva adom. Lesachek kehti? Bo nesachek ba kador. Tufoset kador. Chances are that not a single word has registered with you. Forget understanding it, but not even the sound or even a single word has registered with you. So let's do it slightly differently. Ze kador adom ve gadol. Zeho adom ve bohek. Ani ohev lesachek ba kador. Zrokote elai. Ani ekol lehatsik oto kiho gadol. Ani ohev seva adom. Tesachek kehti? Bo nesachek ba kador. Fos et kador. Now if I have to ask you what are the meaning of all those words on the right, is there any way that you can get there? Unlikely. So I will give you a third clue. This is good, right? You have something to work on. So at least we can start figuring out which is the word for ball, which is the word for big, which is the word for red. If you were given the choices of would you like to learn language the way that I did it the first time without anything on the board, just talking? Would you like to learn language the second way that I did it with some words written there and my talking? Or would you like to learn the language using this? 100% of the audience would say this. And that is where our problem with language learning starts. When you look at that, just before I get to that, the language that I used was Hebrew. Chances are that some of you may know German or French, so I can't use that. So I don't know Hebrew, but I know those few sentences. Whenever you work with equivalence, which is the fact that this is a big red ball, ze kador adom ve gadol, there is an equal to sign that comes into play. The moment any kind of an equal to sign or a linearity comes into play, the intelligence that we use is a logical process. We approach that problem in a very, very logical way. Language, unfortunately, is an organic and intuitive construct that is far beyond logical understanding. You can deconstruct it logically, which is how we make meanings, which is how grammar comes into play. You can deconstruct it. But if you try to construct language using that same process, the kind of failure that you just encountered earlier and the kind of failure that many of us encounter when we learn a language without the environment supporting us, that is a failure that we will all be subject. In India, we have a very, very unique problem. Our higher education infrastructure, our industry and our employment scenario, all are seriously biased towards English, which means that there's a disproportionate amount of value attached to your knowledge of English. If you do not know English, chances are that you will not be learning in this institution. So everybody wants to know English, everybody wants to learn English. And so There's a large scale migration of students to English medium schools. There's a huge, once again, a huge tragedy where students are learning in English without knowing English, which means that it's not just a question of the language being lost. It's a question of the fact that you did not learn science, you did not learn history, you did not learn geography, you learned nothing. You went through a whole process of rote learning. In Tamil Nadu, there are 14,000 English medium schools, of which probably 400 speak English. The rest of them function in a very different way. If you look at the 560 odd engineering colleges that Tamil Nadu has, hardly 30 of them will speak English. The rest of them are learning engineering. They are learning very, very complex subjects without actually knowing the language well. So we need, very briefly, I want to take you through this a little bit more about what I talked about earlier, about equivalences. When you take the average student who enters into first year engineering, chances are that he or she will know the meaning of all these words. But the moment you now take it, use those words to create a conceptual understanding, a very small fraction of them is going to understand this. This is not because I don't know meanings. It's not because I don't know words. Because the idea of syntax and comprehension is very, very different from the idea of meaning. And it is comprehension that leads to language and not words and vocabulary and meanings or grammar that leads to language. And in engineering college and in college after college, the whole idea is that, oh, my students know English, they just can't speak. You know, they are a little bit poor in speaking, but otherwise they know English. Because somehow they manage to write and pass their exams, right? Even the 10th standard student is passing lots of exams in English. That is not a big deal. But at the end of the day, after all of the effort that everybody puts in, the learning efficiency is low because a student who does not know English has to spend 4 times the amount of time just reading that same passage. If you read the first law of thermodynamics, a student who knew English would grasp it immediately. A student who is not good at English will probably have to cycle it 3, 4, 5, 6 times. Chances are maybe he will succeed, maybe he will not succeed. Conceptual understanding is highly compromised. Critical thinking, non-existent. And of course, in today's world, access to knowledge is something that's denied to this student. So where do we come into the picture? About 12 years ago, there was an NGO in Dharavi. Dharavi is one of the largest slums in Mumbai, who said that they have been using our audiobooks. Karadi Tales is a sister company which used to produce audiobooks. Some of you may be familiar with it. And so they were using the audiobooks to teach English in those slums. And they said, you know, something fantastic is happening. Our students are all grasping English very well. They are enjoying it. We went there and found out that, well, they were having a good time, but it could not be said that they had learned English as a result of whatever was happening. But what we found out was that each and every one of those children spoke 3 languages. Because you may have come from Orissa, landed up in Dharavi. The parents come in search of employment. There's Marathi happening, Hindi happening, Oriya happening. Somebody else comes from Karnataka, so there's Kannada, there is Hindi, there's Marathi. In no time, in a span of 6 to 12 months, a foreign language has been acquired. This is how easily that was happening, and that's what led us to start looking at this in a much deeper way. And so there's something dramatically wrong with the pedagogy of language that exists across the world, and right here in our own backyard, our multilingualism holds a solution to this. In Karadi Path, which is a methodology that we talked about, one of the first things that we do is how do you learn a language intuitively, which means that you don't use equivalences, you never teach the meaning of a single word, you never teach a single rule of grammar, but there's exposure, 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 which leads to a language experience, and that results in a language learning. So this is something that we call derivative learning. Derivative learning basically means that all the learning is derived by the learner. The experience is provided by the classroom or the teacher or whatever is the environment, the learning environment that you create. And at the end of it, there's a learning outcome. But we are very, very afraid of derivative learning. Because as part of the derivative learning, you must accept that in between you don't know how this process works. When you learn to ride a cycle, you don't know how you learn to ride the cycle. You get on it, you fall down, you get on it, you fall down. One day you learn. You still cannot explain how the brain manages to do this. If you have to take a curve in a cycle, your body decides what is the appropriate angle of inclination. If you were to calculate this using your physics knowledge, you have to know your weight, the bicycle's weight, the coefficient of friction, the radius of curvature, the velocity at which you are driving, and then it will take you about 5 minutes to figure out what the angle of inclination should be, and where are you? On the ground by then, right? So this is the fantastic nature of intuitive intelligence, and this is the fantastic nature of derivative learning, that it's capable of doing a lot of things. All the languages that we learned it through this derivative process because we had the opportunity from the environment to do so. It's not the classroom that led to it. So it's just a question of constructing lots of context, lots of communication, resulting in understanding, eventually resulting in speaking. The moment understanding crosses a threshold, you will speak. Nobody has to teach you to speak. This is just the natural way that we are created. And then you teach reading and writing, and then you are home free with the language. What we managed to do with Karadipath is that in approximately about 96 hours, a child can go from not knowing any English at all to being completely fluent in English. And this is something that's happening now. We are working with lots of government schools. We have about 420 schools that we currently work with. It's a very recent thing that we have actually offered outside. And this is showing, we double the outcomes in 30 to 40 hours for those students who have already had 300 to 400 hours of classroom teaching. So it's not a minor improvement, but it's a transformation of sorts. So thank you.